Okay, I feel really lucky to be able to talk after this presentation by Laura, because I think she's already touched on some issues I want to talk about, though probably rather from a very abstract and theoretical perspective, namely a Marxist perspective even. I see no one's been running out of the room, so I'll just go ahead. Determining data mining is just a fancy way to say, let's just talk about what data is, and even more concretely, let's talk about what data might be under conditions of capitalism. Why should we ask that? Because the question itself might sound bordering on idiocy to ask what are data on, I don't know, day 2 of this conference, or day 1 of this conference in the afternoon. But mainstream economics hasn't really found a satisfying answer on what kind of economic entity is it that accommodates all the intuitions, even the more, especially the more critical intuitions about what data might be. And connected to such a question, obviously, is which sorts of rights can be assigned to which agents. And for instance, in Bruno Cabasha's talk, we heard a lot about individual or collective rights. So if you talk to your mainstream economists these days, there's a good chance that they talk about data as the new oil. I think the fact that we've all come here already hints to that. Most of us wouldn't agree with that, just talking about it as some natural resource that can be appropriated, and that's the whole story. We've heard a lot of other words. We've heard asset, we've heard we haven't heard that here, luckily, but some have talked about data as a currency that works on the internet somewhere. So mainstream economic opinions are getting kind of bizarre, which is why I suggest, hey, why not turn to Marx? Okay, maybe first one more critical intuition, because on the one side you have these mainstream economics that talk about natural resources, then on the other you have social critics who often put up an image like this. So platforms are like the railway who appropriate the land that actually belongs to, in this case, I don't know, the native inhabitants of that land, and speak of data colonialism, based on the fact that in colonialism and colonial appropriation there was quite a lot more violence and coercion involved than is in the digital economy today. I'd strongly advise against using that. And this is finally why Karl Marx might have something interesting to say about what might be wrong with the digital economy. So this is basically why, if we talk about what is wrong in the economy, I think a strong intuition might be that data is somehow belonging to the wrong guys in many ways. So I think there's an intuition that my data, when I'm on a platform or whatever, belongs to me in a certain sense, but it cannot be used by me, which is the very raison d'etre of my data, I believe. So based on definitions of property rights, I know property might be problematic, and we've talked about this already by David Hume, who says property is just a convention. Then John Locke, who says property emerges when someone works on nature and on the world. And if you combine these, you get to something like property might be both. It's a convention that works only under capitalism, but it's also, it belongs to someone who works with something from nature. And then Marx would add to that, oh yeah, that's right, but stuff can be expropriated, and the rightful owners lose the right of property. And obviously, under capitalism, the capitalists are the owner, are the new owners of these goods then. So what I suggest is that reading Marx, you can come up with 3 different ideas of what data actually are, and accordingly which rights could be assigned to it and so on. Maybe the obvious one to start with is labor. You may have heard that Marx was quite fond of labor, and we've heard about the labor we do for Facebook, for instance, or we do for like these Google, where you have to detect road signs and stuff. So that's quite obviously labor, I'd say. You could extend that notion to the entirety of social media, and I'm going to try and explain in a second how so. So there's a tradition of talking about data as labor that starts with one Marxist media critic called Dallas Smith in the 70s. He basically said that if you watch TV and advertisement, you are doing labor for those who sell the ad space, and it's probably clear how this could relate to what you do on social media, where you also watch advertisement. The difference between TV and social media is that you're also datafied, and your data is used to target that ad space. And there's a different strand of thought, Italian post-operationism, in which it has been argued that by creating content online, for instance on social media, you do unpaid labor for platforms. And then there's your standard Marxist, in this case Christian Fuchs, who has tried to extend that notion to data. So if you create data online, you do labor for platforms. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is that this is not Yogi Poikula, it's Jaron Lanier. The notion of data as labor has been kind of hijacked. It's originally a Marxist idea that is like 40 years old, and now it's been used to justify proposals like the radical data markets. So this is just a side note. Maybe when we talk about data as labor, we should have a deeper look into how Marx, because that's where the idea is originally coming from, defined labor. So for him, it's interaction of labor power with objects and instruments of work, so that use values are created as products and turned into commodities. Now, let's try and see if we can apply that definition to social media. The objects of labor would be platforms, or more abstractly, the experiences that other users have on platforms, because that's what you work. That's the end of the causal relation that begins with your work or your activity online. The instruments of work are whichever device you manually connect to the internet with. The products could be likes, or it could be whatever is manifested as data then. And the commodity is what is the sort of capital that these data are turned into, in this case, targeted advertisement space. So this is one proposition to frame data as labor, but there's good arguments against it. And two of these arguments would be, well, if even messaging your friends and anything you do online is labor, then what isn't labor? Because messaging your friends certainly doesn't feel like labor, and there's, I think, a strong intuitive argument against that. To frame that more abstractly, actually, and in more Marxist terms, would be, if every social relation that we engage in is already labor, if messaging your friends and everything is already labor, then why would capitalism need platforms or data extraction mechanisms to exploit it at all? And I think that's quite a strong argument. But on the other hand, there's a lot of social relations that aren't that are not labor, but still capitalism is able to exploit it. And what might come to mind is feminist objections to that argument, because labor done in the household is not labor under market relations, but it's still something that may be exploited by capitalism, and it creates value, reproductive value. Yeah, that was basically this. And then there's the first of these arguments is that we've talked about this already, that it's oftentimes hard to attribute labor or data to individuals. Meaning, I don't know, if we use this Screen IO tool, and all this data is probably the product of all of us here in this room. And even if Gianfranco posted something, he was impressed by Laura's talk, so it's somehow a social construct that led to the creation of this data. So to deal with such objections to the notion of data as labor, I suggest that we turn to a rather unusual reading of Marx, or kind of a hidden gem in his writings, which is the notion of a general intellect. Marx defines that as a society's entire knowledge, which is becoming embodied in the automated systems of machines. And under capitalism, that's the capitalist machines. And we see Tiziana Terranova again, we see two other Italian-sounding names. These are all post-operationists who have thought and written quite a bit about the general intellect, and each define it in different ways. To maybe speed up the whole thing a little, the definition of the general intellect has, for good reasons, been broadened to eventually include any spontaneous cooperation, communication, self-expression, linguistic play. And then we still see this notion of free labor, of user-created content that is labor. But Terranova also uses the idea of a general intellect to say that, well, if you think about post-Fordist knowledge work, which is probably the kind of work that most of us are doing here, very little of what we contribute as value is actually coming out of our own personhood somehow. It's rather like, for instance, you're a designer or a programmer, and you have an idea when you're walking down the park, and not when you're at your workplace. Or maybe you engage in conversations at this conference, and you have lots of ideas. So this is some kind of collectively created value and ideas that is only then later embodied in your labor and eventually into capital. So this is the basic idea behind the general intellect being embodied into capital. Terranova only says that for content, but you could think about data in very similar terms. Maybe let's once again look deeper into the original text by Marx. This hidden gem that I mentioned is the so-called machine fragment. And if we read this, and maybe not think about the kind of industry that Marx must have had in mind, but think about the industry that now is arising and which is data-driven, we might not talk about the machine fragment anymore, but about the machine learning fragment, because I believe that these two things closely resemble each other. In both cases, there is some labor process that doesn't really look or feel like labor, but that, as Marx writes, has been subsumed under the total process of the machinery itself. And it's less the labor of an individual as an embodiment of the general intellect then. To maybe make that a little clearer, let's consider 3 examples. The first one would be a driver working on Uber. The second would be someone using social media on her cell phone. And the third one would be health data of some kind. So I've just given more or less random examples of the data types that could be extracted there. And then there's a process of aggregation as well, and analytics, obviously. And in the end, come out, in this case, more or less machine learning-based applications that make use of this data. Just to make clear how the relation of labor that embodies the general intellect ends up being embodied in machinery that physically confronts the worker as capital in the end. For instance, if you consider the Uber driver, they, or actually a collective of many Uber drivers, they kind of embody the knowledge that they have about a given city in which they drive into the database that Uber uses to come up with navigation systems, and maybe the intuitive knowledge that Uber drivers have about the supply and demand becomes embodied in the algorithmic markets that Uber creates, and eventually even in autonomous vehicles that Uber might develop to get rid of the drivers themselves. I think for time reasons I'll leave it to this one example. One obvious question that this might beg is, well, there's still some labor. There's one kind of workaround that you could define the data in the first stage as raw material, because there's been previous labor applied to it, and then still further labor that is being done in the analytics. So this is something that has been suggested. Now I guess it's up to all of us to decide which of these suggestions we favor. I personally suggest that we just take all of them and rather think about what they imply and which kind of rights might be connected to them. So we've had the general intellect, we've had labor, there are interlaces between them, because if you think of free labor that is being done on social media, it's an embodiment of the general intellect, but through labor. Then there's the idea of raw material, which means there's different processes of labor, and in between data is raw material. And the interesting question to my mind is, which kind of rights may be assigned to these various types or economic entities of data. And just an intuitive framework would be to say that maybe the general intellect, if it is an entire society's knowledge, is more of a collective thing, whereas labor might be more of an individual thing. So this is something that I hijacked from Bruno Kabasha's slides earlier. I think you could apply something like this and try to put it on something like this and see if different data governance models fit different perceptions of data as labor. And then obviously, as a closing remark, this track is called Our Data, and I think the whole MyData community might have an interest in thinking about where on this graph of collective or individual rights they want to position themselves. So look around. Okay, thanks.